furiously rage together? Why do the people imagine a vain thing? Why do the nations rage so furiously together? Why do the people imagine a vain thing? Imagine a vain thing. Why do the nations so furiously rage together? And why do the people, imagine a vain thing? Why do the nations rage so furiously together, And why do the people imagine a vain thing? Imagine a vain thing. And why do the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers take counsel together. Take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Against the Lord and his anointed.
Sayre for Senate Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate against Schumer, and I chose this piece, as I hope you could hear in the words, "Why do the nations so furiously rage together?" from Handel's Messiah and from Psalms. And in case it wasn't clear to you, the words are, "Why do the nations so furiously rage together? Why do the people imagine a vain thing?" Why do the people imagine a vain thing? And then the interlude section, "The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers will counsel together against the Lord and his anointed." But why do they imagine a vain thing? And I think these words are extremely appropriate for the situation we are facing today, where we are on the precipice of plunging into thermonuclear war, economic collapse and devastation, or particularly if we can get a shift in the United States, moving to a new system, a new paradigm, because the old order has completely collapsed. And part of the danger arises from this question of vanity. And by vanity, I mean, when you hear the expression something is in vain, what does that mean? Well, there's an interpretation, it's in vain because it's not going to work, or you're going to make a lot of effort, but it will be in vain. It's also in vain because it's not in coherence with reality, with natural law. So you have people in the United States, in NATO, and particularly being directed by the British very explicitly, who somehow think that through threat of force or actual force, they can cause other leaders like Putin and Xi Jinping either to capitulate or that they have the power to destroy their nations. And what you see happening is that these nations don't intend to be destroyed. They are coming together and working out various agreements, which you can imagine creates hair pulling and garment rending rage in the powers that be. And this rage is so extreme that you have now the nation of Israel has decided that it's not going to have any celebrations on VE Day. May 9th will be the 77th anniversary of the defeat of Adolf Hitler. Many, many people are in Israel because of the experience of their direct family members, their parents, their grandparents, at the hands of the Nazis. The end of that war, the defeat of Hitler, is something that would have been celebrated. But instead, because they're allying with this British US Great Reset order, they're simply not going to celebrate the defeat of Nazism. As people may know, in the United Nations, there was a vote to condemn the glorification of Nazism. The US and Ukraine were the nations that voted against such a thing. They said it was in the name of free speech. Well, now in the name of free speech, we have the creation of the Disinformation Governance Board of the Department of Homeland Security to make sure that people don't have the opportunity to use their own reason, but to only follow blindly the dictates coming from this war faction and destruction of civilization faction. So I don't want to say too much. As everyone knows, we are in the throes of a completely, I wanted to say insane. Our part of it is not insane, but the imposition of it is insane. Petitioning drive for me to get my name on the ballot requires 45,000 ballot signatures. We're in the middle of this. It is extremely intense. That's why we were slightly late tonight. All of us are involved. If there's anyone listening who wants to help, who can come in from out of state and help collect signatures, who's in the state of New York, please sign up to help, and also donate would be extremely important. But otherwise, what I wanted to do, just to put this whole fight into perspective and to give you some of the economic background, which you may not be aware of, I wanted to bring in one of the major editors and editors of the Economics Division and Ibero-America, Dennis Small. Dennis, go ahead, and don't forget to unmute.
That was very good advice. I'm glad you reminded me. Thanks very much, Diane. There was a statement issued over the last 24, 48 hours by the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Nebenzia, where he said that Russia is being subjected to a NATO proxy war. In other words, that there is a war going on against Russia, and it is being waged in effect by NATO using Ukraine as a proxy. Now, that might sound a little exaggerated for those who are not familiar with the facts on the ground or have not followed what we have been publishing in Executive Intelligence Review and elsewhere, but this is emphatically the case. Not just the arms and the weapons that have been sent, the training of the personnel on the ground. There are two statements that speak to this point this week. One by General Hilbert, who is the head of the 7th Army, and what he did, he's been in charge for a half dozen years or more of training people in Germany and elsewhere from Ukraine. There are 23,000 people that he's trained. And what he said over the last 8 years, I want to communicate a message from the people that we've been talking to in Ukraine and who we've trained, and that is that the Russians have made one major mistake in this entire war, and that is that they didn't launch the operation 8 years ago. They gave us 8 years to prepare. Now that kind of puts an end to the myth that this was an unprovoked action by Russia. There was no reason for them to do this. There was a very good reason, and that is what was already going on for 8 years. But in one sense, that's the least of it. There's also a retired American general, General Repass, retired, that's sort of in quotations. He now works for the Pentagon as a contractor. He was in charge of Special Operations Commando, and what he said is he's involved also in training people who've been working in Ukraine. And he said, look, the way we have to do this is 5 countries, United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, et cetera, Germany, have to each stand up an 8,000 person brigade. 5 countries, 8,000 Ukrainians. We arm them, we train them, we equip them with NATO equipment. We make sure that all of the NATO interactions function. And there you have then 40,000 troops. And it's almost as if it were a NATO division, which is, of course, exactly what it would be. And then he went on to say, what we need to do is we need to bleed the Russians dry. We've got to go for 2 years of war, at least, on this thing. And, you wonder how it is possible that people, having read and understood what the Russians have said about nuclear warfare, which is that their policy, their standing policy, is they will not launch nuclear warfare unless A, they are attacked with nuclear warheads first, or B, their very existence as a nation is threatened. And how it's possible when this clear threat to the existence of Russia as a nation is underway by NATO in plain view, why people think that they can push Russia to the edge on this and somehow get away with it. You wonder about the sanity of these people, and there is a real question about that, especially since the Russians have demonstrated they have the weaponry, like the Kinzhal hypersonic weapons and so on, which they've used in battle in Ukraine. And you really have to wonder what is going on here? How crazy is this? What are people thinking in London and in Washington and in the NATO capitals? Well, this week, that level of insanity had to take a back seat for the moment, because now the stated plan is to launch financial and economic nuclear warfare against China. And this was stated in an article by the Atlantic Council, which was written by Hung Tran, who is a former deputy director of the IMF, a very high official in the IIF, which is the creditors cartel. And what he said is, look, we've simply got to look at the pros and cons. If we were to freeze and steal the $3 trillion in assets that the Russians have, that the Chinese have, what might we have to lose? So let's just sort of engage in game theory, a tabletop war scenario of financial warfare. Well, we could steal that, but then they, after all, have $1.1 trillion of US treasuries. There's a couple of $1 trillion of foreign investment in China. Well, maybe they could seize that. And then, of course, there's the minor problem that 18% of American imports come from China and 22% of European imports come from China. And yes, that could lead to a problem, he said, but really what we've got to look at in this situation is that, and I want to give you this quote, he said, in short, a scenario of Western sanctions coupled with Chinese countermeasures could lead to substantial damages. This could lead to a situation of economic MAD, or mutually assured destruction, reinforcing the more catastrophic nuclear mutually assured destruction. So the scenario that is underway is to open on the China front exactly the same kind of complete insanity of warfare as is now being waged against Russia. And incidentally, Joe Biden is being sent off, trundling off on a trip to Asia at the end of May. I don't know if he really knows where he's going to be going, but it will be Asia, it will be Tokyo, where the agenda is, let's box in China, let's see if we can wreck their economy as well. Now, the intentions here, just to be sure that it's clear, the president of the European Commission, that's the executive body of the European Union, Charles Michel, I believe he's Belgian, stated yesterday, what we should do in the EU, now that we have frozen Russian assets, is we should just confiscate them. There's hundreds of billions of dollars, let's confiscate them. For those of you who have trouble with 3-syllable words, I will translate confiscate into a 1-syllable word, rob. Now, I don't know if Charles Michel has been reading the Communist Manifesto or something and he wants to expropriate the property of people, but this is what they're planning to do. Now, take those two images and ask yourself the question, what can possibly be going on with, on the one hand, the image of nuclear warfare being provoked with Russia, on the other hand, economic mutually assured destruction with China, from which no one will survive on each of those points. And ask yourself the simple question, what could possibly be provoking this level of insanity? Is it drug-induced psychosis? It could be partially that, but there's a much bigger question. And the issue in one sense is very simple, but people often don't see it because there is a fear factor and a psychological blind spot. And this is the crucial question where Lyndon LaRouche's evaluation comes in. It is the breakdown of the international financial system. It is a systemic breakdown of the entire transatlantic system, which is now occurring, which is driving these forces into warfare. They cannot possibly stand for a situation whereas their entire system implodes and collapses on itself with no solution from their standpoint whatsoever, not acceptable to have an alternative in the form of China and Russia available for the countries around the world that are being destroyed by their economic policies. Now, I want to show you in conclusion a graph which will, if you look at it closely, will give you an idea of what's going on here. Now, this is with updated numbers, and it shows two things in particular. If you could put that on the screen, maybe it is on the screen, I'm just seeing a different one. These are world financial aggregates and quantitative easing. Now, the red curve is the growth of world financial aggregates. In other words, the entire global speculative bubble. And this has now reached the point, after dipping down a little bit after the 2008 blowout, this is now up in the range of $1.9 quadrillion. This is the latest calculation we've done based on BIS statistics and others up through the end of 2021. It's very close to 2 quadrillion. That's a 2 followed by 15 zeros. It's unimaginably large. It's unimaginably unpayable. It is a complete total speculative bubble. How have they prevented this thing from imploding so far? Well, it's called quantitative easing, which is the other graph here, the blue line, which since the 2008 blowout has gone up and up and up, and especially in this recent period, both with the Federal Reserve and the central banks of Japan and the EU and so on, is now pushing close to $30 trillion in pure funny money. Quantitative easing, which has gone to nothing but trying to maintain that financial bubble. That financial bubble has now unleashed inflation throughout the entire economy. The reason that food prices are going up and that gasoline prices are going up and that all prices are going up, yes, there is an effect of the shortages. Yes, there is definitely an effect of the sanctions against Russia. But the underlying reason is that you are dealing with a gross hyperinflation of the entire financial aggregate system. And that translates into the inflation process. Now, with that going on, the Federal Reserve this week raised interest rates by 0.5%. And if you just think of what that means when that blue curve starts going down on the quantitative easing, which is what they're intending to do, where the quantitative easing stops, the interest rates go up, this is going to blow out the everything bubble. It will blow out third world debt. It is going to blow out corporate debt. It is going to blow out the housing market. It's going to blow out the entire financial system. And it is that is the driving force towards war, both economically and financially. Now, this may seem like a really scary big package to think about, but it's actually very simple because the solution is immediately at hand. It's what Lyndon LaRouche has been talking about for decades and which Diane Sayre has picked up in her campaign, which is a full top to bottom bankruptcy reorganization of the speculative bubble and to bring about a world development program based on the common interests of the nations that are involved here. So when you look at the destruction going on in Ukraine, and if you look at the upcoming all-out warfare with China, remember what's at issue here. It is a bankrupt system that can and must be replaced.
Great, thank you very much. I have also with us tonight Joel DeJean, who is another LaRouche independent candidate. He is running for the U.S. House of Representatives in Texas in the 38th District. And it's a newly created district. The Republican nominee is what you might call a Bush baby, Wesley Hunt, neocon warmonger. And Joel, I think you may have some thoughts on the situation that we're in and what Dennis just went through.
Thank you, Senator Sayre. You may remember during Trump's last year in office, the New York Times had multiple stories of how Russia's GRU, their military intelligence unit, was offering bribes, bounties to the Taliban to kill American soldiers. Now, this was denounced by the usual suspects, Adam Schiff and the other warmongers in the Congress, saying that Trump was soft on Putin, was not protecting American troops. But there's one problem with that is because of the deal that Trump made with the Taliban to get out of Afghanistan, as long as American troops and NATO troops were heading out the door, the Taliban agreed not to attack American and NATO troops. And during the last year of Trump's term, no U.S. troops, no U.S. soldiers were killed by the Taliban in Afghanistan. So that story died. Now, last week, the New York Times had two stories. One where, from anonymous sources, they said that U.S. intelligence supplied to the Ukrainian military were responsible for killing up to 12 Russian generals. Now you can imagine if 12 US generals or even one general had been killed by the Taliban because of intelligence from Russia, they would have been held to pay. Well, that wasn't all of it. Today, the New York Times has another story saying that the sinking of the Russian flagship of the Black Sea Fleet last month was because of U.S. intelligence supplying targeting information for Ukrainian missiles. Now, the ship, the Moscow, was not offshore where you could see it. It was 65 miles away from the shore. So Ukrainians had to have precise targeting information to hit the ship. So now you have the U.S. not only supplying lethal weapons, the U.S. is supplying intelligence that is killing Russian generals and sinking their ships. So you can imagine what the reaction from Russia will be. Now, this is the type of insane policy that a lot of American officers, retired and active, are wholeheartedly supporting. Now, there is a backlash against this. This week, the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which include former intelligence officers like Scott Ritter, Bill Betty, Kirk Wiebe, and other true patriots, issued a letter to Biden saying that the policies that the U.S. is following in Ukraine will lead to war, will lead to thermonuclear war, and the U.S. has to change its policy. So there is that fight now out in the open between those.
Back to the shortage.
Are you hearing me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, because I hear background.
Yeah, sorry, that was the mistake here.
Okay. So you have the true patriots like Scott Ritter, Bill Betty, and others who are saying that this policy has to change. And you have the flunkies like Defense Secretary Lloyd George Austin, a West Point graduate from 1975 who rose to the rank of 4-star general commanded Central Command. That means he had responsibility for the Afghan and Iraqi theater, which were total disasters for the US military. So these idiots are now taking the lessons they did not learn from Iraq and Afghanistan and using their so-called intelligence in Ukraine to march us towards World War III. So we have laid out the alternative. It's quite simple. We have to not only have a strategic and security architecture to provide security for Russia, Ukraine, and other countries in Europe and around the world, but we have to have an economic development architecture. And I'll just touch on one point on that. This week, there was an offshore technology conference in Houston, which, according to reports, had 24,000 participants, oil executives, engineers, petroleum engineers, talking about the latest and greatest in offshore technology. Now, you would think that's offshore technology to get more oil and gas, since we're boycotting Russian oil and gas. But no, a lot of the panels involve how to profit by using carbon capture and storage. In other words, you burn the oil, the gas, you capture the CO2, you pipe it into the Gulf of Mexico and bury it. So we're talking about billions of tons of CO2, millions of tons of steel piping to bury CO2 into the ground. Now, we had a rally outside the huge stadium where this conference was being held. And one of the signs was very provocative, said, "Carbon capture is for retards." Any oil executive, any petroleum engineer that goes along with this has got to be a total imbecile. Instead of standing up for their industry, they're going along with this. Now, not only that, yesterday, the conference panels included panels on how to profit from offshore windmills. So not only are they burying CO2, which should be going to green plants for food, they are proposing useless windmills now, not only to stick them in West Texas, but to stick them offshore. So these bozos have to be given an alternative. We need fossil fuels, increase production until we come up with a commercial controlled thermonuclear fusion and escalate our production of small modular fission reactors. That's the energy plan that we should have. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you both. So we're going to end fairly quickly because we have a meeting on the petitioning, but I wanted to make sure that I said to everyone who is watching that the LaRouche organization, the Schiller Institute, and I endorse their actions, are urging that everybody contact their congressman and senator to express your adamant opposition to continuing this war against Russia. We should not be arming Ukraine. There should be negotiations to come to a peaceful settlement, and there should be a conference, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has proposed, for a new security and development architecture. The Congress is being stampeded, this being an election year, by the media, which, as we know, is run by our misnamed intelligence agencies, to be convinced that the American population really wants war. Americans are getting bamboozled and played on emotionally, so they're all like when we were told the Iraqis were stealing babies out of the Kuwaiti baby incubators. Similar heart-rending stories about what's going on, so that Americans may foolishly think we should be sending more weapons to Ukraine, But then if you ask them, do you think we should have a war with Russia? Should we have boots on the ground? Do you support nuclear war? They would overwhelmingly say no. That is not what's being conveyed by the press. So it's really urgent that everybody get to their representative on this. That being said, Dennis, I actually was wondering if you could say something also about what's happening in the rest of the world. Is the rest of the world coming into line with this Anglo-American NATO policy, or how are countries lining up on this?
No, there's a tremendous amount of opposition. Some of it pretty well informed, others not so well informed, but they can smell a snake oil salesman when they smell one. There's a lot of discussion, for example, in countries in Ibero-America over how is it possible that the Biden administration was able to snap its fingers and come up with $30 billion for this Lend-Lease program to arm the Ukrainians. And for the last 10 years, they haven't been able to come up with a quarter of that amount for Central America for an economic development program, which is needed to make sure that the area can pull itself out of the drug trade. I mean, this is an area where the LaRouche movement has called for the United States and China to cooperate in development to stop a problem for everybody, which is poverty and drugs and so on and so forth. So when this happens in these countries and they see what's going on, they don't buy into it. There's a tremendous amount of opposition all across Africa. Half the countries of Africa, despite the pressure put against them, have not been in favor of the economic sanctions. I think, in fact, the majority of the planet is not going along with this. India is a very important case in point. It is, for the moment, the second largest country by population in the world, but it's growing more rapidly than China. It will soon be the largest. And they have not been allowing themselves to be pressured into attacking Russia and breaking relations with them and so on. So I think that across the world, I think a lesson to be drawn for us here is that there are natural allies for the United States population to pull away from this crazy policy of war, both economic and military, and to establish a relationship, a win-win economic relationship of development, where we would work with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Russians, as Lyndon LaRouche always called for, a four powers type of agreement. I mean, this is for the benefit of all of the population of all of these countries. The only people who don't like it and will not ever come to like it are the City of London and the Wall Street bankers. But they're the ones who want to reduce the world's population down to 1 billion. So why follow their views on this thing? So I think there's a tremendous amount of resonance around the world for a policy that in its economic substance can actually turn the corner on this war drug.
Yeah, I think so as well. And it would be good for the American people to be everything we can do to make people aware of it, because I think it's hard here. We tend not to hear much about the rest of the world. Many Americans only speak one language. And actually, the leaders of many of these nations are some of our best allies. So I think that's really true. Joel, any other thoughts that you have?
Yes, there is an incoming presidential press spokesman who was named today, Miss Jean-Pierre, who was born in Martinique, but from Haitian parents. And she might want to ask President Biden, is the policy of allowing Ukrainian refugees to come in virtually without any checks? And there's talk now that they will be allowed in with their dogs. So Ukrainian dogs are given more rights than Haitians when it comes to immigrating to this country. And it's not like the Haitians are just coming here for a free ride. With the increase in fuel and food prices, there is a further catastrophe occurring in countries like Haiti, Yemen, Egypt, all over the world. So those are some questions that this new press secretary should ask her boss.
Thanks. Absolutely right. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because as we get everyone thrown into a hysterical media frenzy over the Supreme Court and Roe versus Wade, we are facing nuclear war in which everybody, born and unborn, will be dead, and we already have tens of thousands of people dying and starving in many nations, including, as you said, Haiti, Afghanistan, where over 14,000 newborn babies have died of starvation this year because of the policies of the Biden administration. Now, just before we close, a couple updates on the campaign. One question that comes up a lot and I've been getting badgered about on Facebook, I'm going to take up right now. Why don't you run as a Republican? Aren't you splitting the vote? Yeah, and you're laughing, Congressman DeJean, because you get the same thing. Well, the Republican Party is no different than the Democratic Party much of the time, and that's, for example, why Schumer has been in there so long. In this case, they chose to nominate a fellow named Joe Pinion, whom I call No Pinion, because if you go to his website, he has a position on absolutely nothing. It literally has 3 sections: why I'm such a wonderful person, volunteer, and donate. And if you go to the Federal Election Commission, you discover that Joe Pinion's headquarters, his campaign headquarters, is in McLean, Virginia. Now, I don't know if they're sharing an office with the CIA, but obviously it's the same city. So the point of our candidacies is that we have to have a voice for an actual policy of reason, which is urgently needed. What I can guarantee absolutely is that there is no such thing as the status quo. Things are not going to proceed on however you think they have been. There is no stability whatsoever. Leibniz was very clear on this question of no two things being identical, nothing being the same in time. You have further developments of scientists of the question of chirality, of directionality. We are moving, and we're always either moving for progress or for disaster. We're now at a point where what we are in is completely unsustainable. It's a moment of tension. So the policies that we are talking about, don't write them off. Helga LaRouche was making this point either earlier today or a couple days ago, that people shouldn't say, well, how could you get all the nations together? They're always fighting. That's impossible. What you're saying is just pie in the sky. That'll never happen. And I would say, well, during the 150 years of religious warfare, or what was called the 30 Years' War, where people committed unbelievable atrocities against each other, very much like what the Nazis in Ukraine are doing to the Russian prisoners of war, somehow they managed to realize that if they continued on that path, there would be nothing left. We are on such a path right now, and therefore human beings, being capable of change, are capable of dramatically changing our direction. And that is what has to be done, and it is my hope that my campaign, Joel's campaign, the work of the Schiller Institute, Helga LaRouche in particular, who's being seen more and more as an international spokeswoman for these policies, can affect such a change. So with that, I am going to conclude. Is there anything I've forgotten that either of you really wants to say? Joel, go ahead.
If I can leave you with a mental image of both parties, think of the Democrats as the Titanic racing towards the iceberg field, but the Republicans are like the Hindenburg, full of gas and about to blow sky high. Now today, May 6th, is the 85th anniversary of the Hindenburg blowing up. So that's why you don't want to hit yourself to either party.
Well, thank you very much. And with that thought, I think we'll conclude, and I hope very much that we're all alive next week and can have this show next Friday.